Today's episode is brought to you by SVS. Based in Youngstown, Ohio, SVS delivers thrilling and immersive audio experiences from their highly acclaimed speakers, subwoofers, cables, wireless audio gear, and more. SVS is leading a sound revolution by offering expert support, generous owner benefits, and a world-class performance that far exceeds the price. Learn more at svsound.com. That's S as in speaker, V as in volume, sound.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by Shit Audio. Shit Audio designs and builds audio components in California and Texas. Based in Valencia and Corpus Christi, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit shit.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's SCHIIT.com. Today's episode is brought to you by Musical Surroundings. For over 30 years, Musical Surroundings has distributed high-performance analog playback equipment to vinyl enthusiasts and music lovers throughout the United States. Based in Oakland, California, Musical Surroundings represents world-class brands like Clear Audio, Hanna, DS Audio, and their own line of Musical Surroundings phono preamplifiers. To learn more about the exceptional turntables, cartridges, and analog accessories they offer, visit musicalsurroundings.com. That's musicalsurroundings.com. Hello and welcome, friends and lovers of high-fidelity products. You've reached the Occasional Podcast today, and this is Season 6, Episode 9. In Episode 9, we further explore our deep dive into British HiFi with a predominant name in the space called Naim. N-A-I-M. Has produced amplifiers and other assorted hi-fi products for many years, many years, and is, I would consider, very much a heritage British brand, part of those tentpoles that we talk about that kind of hold up what we consider British hi-fi and the UK sound to be. Very, very interesting interview with a gentleman that is both well-versed in the heritage of Naim, but also an engineer and a designer at the brand itself. Steve Sells joins us, and he has a whole wealth of knowledge that he drops on us. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Steve does a great job of conveying not only the technical parts of his job, but also he seems to have a really good grasp on audiophiles and the hi-fi scene in general, and how you and I think about different things within the space. So, as we say, on with the show. Here we go. Naim Audio. Today's show is also sponsored by Wharfedale. For nearly 90 years, Wharfedale has built loudspeakers for music lovers all over the world. With a warm and natural sound signature, their inherently high-fidelity sonic retrieval simply makes you want to listen to your music for longer. Visit wharfdaleusa.com to discover the high-value Diamond 12 series, the best-selling Linton Heritage, and the no-holds-barred Elysian. That's WHARFEDALEUSA.com. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. Very special guest, very excited for this. Steve Sells, Technical Director of Electronics at Naim Audio. Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. How you doing?
Oh, very good, thank you, and you're very welcome. Good to be here.
You know, I do appreciate you jumping on, because there's quite a bit of difference. It's the early morning for Mark Phillips from PTA, part-time audiophile, and myself, Brian Hunter.
This is still my first cup of coffee.
Yeah, I'm still on my first tea.
Yeah.
And I think Steve might be getting into his water, but it's 5 o'clock there. So we're working on a little bit of time, but I do appreciate you jumping on. And I think Mark and I are just very excited to kind of chat with you, because over the past, what would you say, year and a half, Mark and I have been exploring the idea of British HiFi. Mark is a huge fan of British HiFi and myself as well. And we have done a series of podcasts exploring what is British HiFi exactly. We recently did a podcast on the history of British HiFi, including the legendary LS35A. And we kind of were very excited to follow up with you on the other side of that with, British amplifiers. I think Naim is a really long-running brand that has really established itself as one of the cornerstones of the British HiFi sound over the years. And I just kind of wanted to launch into it with a question submitted from our illustrious leader, Scott Hall, the publisher at Part-Time Audiophile.
Okay.
So if it seems a little more illustrious than my usual questions, that you can blame him for that. Everyone seems to have gotten into this because they were chasing some type of sound, something they heard at the time, something they may have made them think of sound differently, or as something they wanted to shape. What was that to you? Was there some iconic sound you wanted to reach for, or was there something that you were repulsed by and said, "Oh my goodness, that sounds horrible. Someone needs to do something," and that person was you?
Yeah, I think we all get those moments. I think for me, it started at a very early age, so it's quite different to how Julian Verica, our founder, sort of started the company. So for me, it was going around to my grandparents' house, and my grandfather was into his audio, and he had this Hacker hi-fi system turned up full, listening to the Philharmonic. And I looked, and he had a tear in his eye, and I thought, wow. And I said to Grandma, why is he playing music so loud? What is this? And she said, it just provokes an emotion. Music, and don't touch the hi-fi. It's very expensive. So that's a reverence to the hi-fi, that it was so powerful that it could make a grown man cry, and you're not allowed to touch it. And he created Galactic systems, and that was great. And then I think it was about 11, so a few years later, I got a loudspeaker. And it was an old-fashioned loudspeaker, and you could take it all apart, take the magnet off, and see all the windings and such. And so I got completely fascinated and made speakers from magnets and nails and coils of wire in a cornflakes box as a diaphragm.
Wow.
But then that sort of got me interested in it, and the signs. I was making amplifiers, all sorts, in my sort of bedroom and shed as I was a child, sort of 15. And then my older brother, he bought, which I thought was like a really high-end hi-fi, is a Rotel 820 amp designed by Stan Curtis, dual CS505 turntable and Kev Curtis speakers. And first time I heard this, I think he played Bowie, and it was stunning. It was absolutely stunning. And I thought, there was a split second. That's what I want to do, design hi-fi. So to uni, and that was it. Never stopped. I got complete obsessed by amplifiers. I'd be designing them every evening, imagining a pile of parts and what you could make out of it. That was my journey into hi-fi.
Do you think that a specific part is ever considered really classic or contributes to a sound in a major way? Like, oh, I can hear that transistor in the amplifier? Or is it just a little more generic than that, and topology rules over top of that more in amplifier design?
I think if you'd have asked me that 20 years ago, I would have thought topology, because I spent so long designing different topologies. But I think almost every topology can be made to work well. So yeah, I think there is definite sound to components, and I can talk about some of those later. We did a custom power transistor. I must tell you about that. But for example, I think the most common ones are capacitors. People say they've got a sound. So and it's a really interesting job that the capacitor's got to do, and the effect it can have. I mean, a capacitor is almost like a microphone, but you try and there's two plates holding an electrical charge. If those plates move, there's a voltage generated. So we can see that the mechanical properties of a dielectric has an effect, certainly as it's playing into a room with a sound pressure. But then there's the dielectric material itself. For our filtering components, we use polystyrene. You think it's a cheap material, but it's incredibly hard material to work with. But it's got the lowest dielectric absorption of any capacitor. It's better than the Teflons and the micas. They get used because you can solder them. Polystyrene is so hard to solder, so you have to. We solder them very carefully, hand soldered every one. But they've got a sound. Even the direction I put in has a sound, and I'm verging on witchcraft here. But if we look at the construction capacitor, there is science behind it. One plate has to be on the outside of the roll. There's two plates, and so if you've got the outside is one conductor, that one can pick up the most noise inside the circuits. So it's a filter circuit. One's connected to ground and one's connected to signal. Connect the one on the outside to ground, for example.
Of all the audiophile witchcraft that people speak about online, which of those kind of arguments or conversations that they have do you feel has the most validity to it? There's so much talk online about so many things that hang in the windows or whatever. But which one do you feel of all the foo-foo voodoo has the most like real grip to it?
Yeah, over the years you hear them, the voodoo get broken down into sounds. You get, okay, so we're not crazy. So I remember back in the 80s thinking, well, it shouldn't matter which way the mains is connected. It should sound the same. And then you can measure it. It's leakage current. So that one, easy myth to break, and that leakage current goes down into connect cables and modulates the audio very slowly. I think one of the craziest ones which I've experienced firsthand is putting your speaker cables on little holders to lift them off the ground. And this one is proper sort of crazy. But what I found out was the way the floors are constructed. You may have, in a concrete floor, you have a steel mesh, and that steel mesh is very much connected to earth, and your loudspeakers run across that, and so you're capacitively coupled by a handful of picofarads and such to your amplifier down there, and so it's driving a high frequency current into the ground, and so you're producing a loop that you didn't sort of expect when you're designing it on the bench. So that's a crazy one.
When was the last time something spontaneously combusted on your bench?
Spontaneous. Fortunately, it doesn't happen too often. I think every year, or maybe even more often than that, an engineer will drop a scope probe lead into an amplifier or a streamer, and you get the sort of the crack, the light, the groan of the engineer, and then you get the smell. But the sort of last one I remember being sort of just by itself, and it blew up. I was testing an inrush circuit for statement, a really big power amplifier, and this is a 5 kVA transformer. You hit mains on it, and it's trying to pull, 500 amps, something like that. So you need an inrush circuit, and I tested, and I was up to 10,000 on-off cycles, and that went up, and it's a lot of power, so it makes a big crack. But redesigned it with completely different components and safety tested to 30,000, which is enough for 30 years. We switch it on and off 3 times a day, so that was a good pass.
You know what always surprised me about an electrical explosion was that when I was a child, we had like a faulty outlet that if you plug something into it, there would sometimes be an explosion. I don't know why. But when it exploded, it always sounded like a video game. It made like an electronic sound. It was like, it made like a tone. And I was like, that's the craziest thing, that electrical explosions can sound like a video game sound at the time. I don't know what that was, but...
Yeah, there's a series on BBC Radio 6, and they ask viewers to send in those sounds that they can think of tracks.
What idea do you think never took off in terms of amplifier design that you thought might have some good substance, that it kind of like be the next thing, but it just kind of never really got adapted?
I think for me, amplifier design gets so niche.
Mm-hmm.
I guess on amplifier, what's not taken off, there's sort of 2. There's polyphase class D, it should be good, but it's not really getting there. So that's having lots of phases to try and blend it out, or a multi-level DAC amplifier. It's incredibly complicated to do, very, very difficult. Class D has to sort of almost stay as it is. Otherwise, I think products that I felt should really take traction but don't is active loudspeakers for high end. And by that means have an external crossover on a speaker, and you can take it off, and then at a later date add an active crossover and get fantastic dynamics. And I think it's because traditionally you get speaker manufacturers make the speaker, and electronics people make the electronics, and so there's never that sort of connection between the two. And we've seen active go into every other brand of audio, whether it's automotive, low-end consumer, into pro audio gear. You can control the cones, you can protect it, you can time delay tweeters to mids. It works fantastically. And so that never traction. We have a product called a Snaxo, and it's great, but we don't sell many. It's disappointed me though.
That's a really interesting point because you can properly adjust the amplifier for the speaker. And a lot of manufacturers I talk to about amplifiers, they try to build the amplifier around the middle, or the thing that will work the best with the most speakers. And that's never like a perfect process for a lot of people. And having the exact speaker matched with exact amplifier, I think just holds a lot of advantages, just like you were saying. So that's a really great point. Let's talk about Class D a little bit more. A lot of amplifier manufacturers that I interview say, I think first let me just say there's a lot of, in the audiophile realm, Class D is not respected very well. But like you said, a lot of people think that it has potential. Where do you think we are currently with Class D, and do you feel like it has potential to be a really, really good audiophile sound if done properly, or are we still pretty far away from that kind of a thing?
I think at the truly high end, I think we're quite some distance away. But I think for the majority of people, it just gets there. It's very powerful. It's got a punch to it. And I think if you get into the fine nuances, then I think analog is going to live for a lot longer. I think the best way I describe it to myself is that Class D is a bit like a Delta Sigma DAC, but it's going to do with power, and it's very hard to control dead time and punch through sample rates, modulation, noise. So it's pretty difficult. It's much easier to make a high-performance DAC and an analog amplifier afterwards. So I think it's always got that disadvantage. But there's been some very clever innovations along the years. There's wide bandgap semiconductors, which will help for switching speed or power density. There's ideas of when the volume is turned down the power supply rates. So you maintain resolution. So I think if we combine enough of these together, then I think it'll get there. But I considered it was designing statement, but it was still getting better performance from Class AB. If you're building statements, it doesn't matter how much power it uses. It's Class D, of course. It can be cheaper because you've got a cheaper power supply, so you're not wasting power. So you've got a third less in your power supply. Significant cost saving in heat sinks and a little bit in shipping. But ultimately, if you want the sound, Class AB or Class A.
We have done an entire podcast on this particular question, but I would just like to get your take on it while we have you on the phone, and as being a person embedded into this type of culture. But do you think that that British HiFi has a unique sound? And to you, this is just your opinion, right? What do you think that is?
Yeah, I do actually. I think it's been watered down a little bit. I think every culture has a slightly different sound, but I think every culture is slightly different. So I think this has been going on for hundreds of years. So it's before audio, we had musical instruments, and every culture had a different musical instrument. And also around about those times where we got houses being built. In England, we don't have so much sun in the summer compared to California, so our trees are shorter. So we can only make our rooms 15 foot wide. And so we've got smaller houses. Our speakers are closer. So because of the sunshine, speakers are closer. So we have a slightly warmer, richer sound. Then I think the way we pronounce our words and our language will also affect what we think is improved intelligibility in speech and vocals. And so maybe some countries will just emphasize them a little bit. Some will trying to rich it up because that's what's considered a nice voice. So I think it's predominantly in speakers, certainly the coloration. And as you know, the BBC had something to contribute to that with the LS5As. I think in England also, we're talking about amplifiers, and traditionally the British HiFi is lower plugs. We've got our smaller rooms. And one of the things that sort of Naim's been to since its sort of conception is very simple signal paths. So there was no tone controls, which was sort of quite controversial at the time. So keeping all that out, and I think, well, certainly in the culture of the hi-fi companies I've worked for, we're not sort of hunting specifications. Names never really put specifications down. I think there's this sort of temptation to go for the lowest noise floor, the lowest distortion, the widest bandwidth, because it sort of makes sense. But I think the more you play with these circuits, the more I think actually, we have to think about this a little bit more. So Baxendale and Lindsay Hood, both of them work on how much feedback you put in amplifiers, and if you come up with a nice simple circuit, it'll probably, if it's a single-ended bass circuit, it'll probably, if it's a single-ended bass circuit, it'll probably, if it's a single-ended bass circuit, that down from 0.1% or 0.01% and reduce it to beat the competition. Then you need to add more feedback to reduce that. And then what happens is that feedback turns that second harmonic into a fourth harmonic, and the fourth harmonic into eighth harmonic. And those are musically consonant. And then when those harmonics pick up, our brain is subconsciously trying to piece where those harmonics are attached to a voice or an instrument. And so we never relax into music. So I think the British HiFi, actually no, European, and a lot of all high-end manufacturers today look into this and have an understanding of this.
On the subject of, second harmonic distortion within the amplifier, do you think that the idea of analog tubes and the introduction of is part of the allure that people like about tubes? Do you think that distortion can be appealing to people and that's why they like tubes? Or is just the natural cleanest sound generally the one that appeals to the most people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we sort of think of tubes as high distortion, and they will have a high, depending on the circuit, generally much higher distortion than transistors. The designers were very resourceful because valves cost a lot of money, and I think that engineering is quite serendipitous. That it gives a very nice sound, and so while it's high in distortion of second, it's low in other distortions. And so I think if you analyze the distortion coming out of a valve amp looking at the 7th, 8th, 9th harmonics, it could be lower than a low distortion transistor amplifier. But there's so much to a valve amp sound. It's a generally higher output impedance, and so you get loudspeaker bass performs differently. It's almost like it's current rather than voltage driven. It's generally got less currents traveling around in its ground circuits, so it's less intermodulation there. They overload beautifully and come out of overload noise, don't hang to the rails. They're microphonic, which can be good and bad. It can add a bit of reverberation or it can add a bit of mush.
Well, switching gears just a little bit, one of the things I found that was really interesting about Naim as a brand was that they are actually involved in some musical, they have their musical label and music production. When I got my Naim Unity Star amp in, I noticed that there was a Naim channel. And the music that it played like a radio station, like often curated, was gorgeous sounding. And I thought it was such an interesting tie-in that it was like from end to end, Naim had this full cycle, right? That would give you this stuff there that was maybe produced in a way that was always thought about, hey, let's think about the sound quality. And when it came out of the speaker, it was great. When did Naim get involved in that? And can you just tell us a little bit about that history?
Yeah, sure. Naim could have been a record label. It really could have just gone the other way. Yeah. Oh, and that radio station, we do that in high res. The software team, Steve Harris and his guys, they've just done a fantastic job, high res streaming. But yeah, Julian Becker, our founder, he was recording his friends and bands in the late '60s, and so he was recording, and he just loved it. And it was really that was what started Naim, doing those recordings and playing it back. And he found the amplifiers didn't give that feeling that he got in the room. He didn't have that emotional connection to the music, so he designed an Apt 200. So yeah, it was. But the record label didn't start until '93, and he sort of created it as a platform for independent artists to express themselves, but also to get that end-to-end sound quality, of microphone to speaker, and it's the only way to control that. And it's worked really nicely. It complements the brand. We all get excited by the new releases. We all get excited by the new releases. We all get excited by the new releases.
I actually have a couple of Naim LPs from the 90s. The one I remember, the one that I still pull out and listen to all the time is there was a Naim version of Elvis Costello's Armed Forces that I have, and it's interesting because it's a slightly different balance. It's a little richer in the bass than the normal pressing that I have. So it was I have a couple. I'd have to go and look at them, but they were all really, really rewarding releases and interesting. So I always thought that was something. When I hear about Naim music, I'm like, oh yeah, I have a few of those.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, his first one was Gary Boyle Electric Glide. Nice and sort of jazzy. Also on the recording side, I should mention that Ken Christensen, a recorder in Chicago, he used to do lots of work with Julian, and they go into Salisbury Cathedral and just do just playing crossed mics and just record like that. So straight recording. True stereo they called it.
So I'm going to come at it as someone who was actually through the 90s a Naim guy. So I was, using Naim, and I had Spendors and Riga and Naim gear. And the first thing I bought, so 1991 is when I bought the Naim Nate 2. And the Naim Nate 2 for me was very... It changed everything I thought about high-end audio. And up to that point, I had mid-fi separates, 100 watts per channel. And then I had a dealer show me the Nate 2, which was anywhere from 15 to 21 watts per channel. They didn't have an exact power rating on it. And the reason I was lured into actually purchasing it was he gave me a very, very good piece of advice, and that I was considering a mid-fi large $1,000 integrated with 150 watts per channel. I had all the features in the world. And then he was showing me this little teeny Naim Nate 2, which was 15, 20 watts per channel. It was, you pick it up with one hand and everything. And he told me that when you're looking at, and it was $1,000 too. And so he says, when you're looking at two products, and they're both $1,000 or whatever, and one is the entry level and one is the top of the line, go with the entry level. And that was because, there's a lot of trickle down from the top models where when you're dealing with $1,000 flagship, it's the best they can possibly do. And that completely changed the way that I looked at high-end audio from that point. So that Naim Nate 2 was sort of my entry point into real high-end and Brit-Fi and everything else. And over the years, I came, I had tons of names. So I had the CD3 CD player, which is the first player I ever owned that lasted more than a year and a half. And that was the reason I got it, because it was so they don't break. Name doesn't break was the slogan back then. And so I had that, and then I had and I went up. I had a NAP 140. I had a lot of different things, but I come back to that Name Nate 2 and how special it was. And I've had the Name Nate 5 and right now I have the Super Nate 3 in the system with Harbeth, which is great. But I keep thinking back to that Nate 2 and how it was just kind of this little thing, this little magical product that worked. And so the first question I have is, I see a lot of companies that are doing anniversary, heritage editions and all that stuff, classic editions. Has you ever looked back at some of these classic name products like the Nate 2, like the NAP 250 power amplifier, and think about going back to those and seeing what you can find out and seeing if there's still a market for it?
Yeah. Actually, I'd love your dealer. I wish I'd been to your dealer when I was buying my first HiFi. I think that's a great philosophy. Yes, we got our 50th anniversary coming, 4th of July, 2023. 50th, and all the ideas are coming out, and we get romantic about Nate. So there's Nate 1 ideas, Nate 2 ideas, 21st century Nate ideas, electrostatic speakers, tape recorders, arrow arms, statement stuff. We are still deciding, but the Nate is one that keeps on coming back. You kind of need a source to go with it.
Yeah. It was just such a little miracle. And it was, at the time, the early 90s, it was $995. And I actually bought one from my dealer, and it was a demo unit. It had actually been out playing for people for 6 weeks, and I bought it for $695, I believe. So that's $700. And so, for whatever reason down the road, I traded it in, had a lot of different equipment. And then when I said, of all the things that I've owned, I have a list of things that are the ones that got away, the ones that I should have never sold, and the Name Nate 2 is at the top of that list. Just was amazed by how great this little product was, how great it sounds. Yeah, I would love to return to that and hear what it is like. It was glorious. I was in an apartment, and that was the greatest one-bedroom apartment audiophile system I've ever listened to.
I got a quick question for both Mark and Steve. Of all the products that Name has made, Mark, what do you think is the most classic or legendary product? And then Steve, I'd love to know if you have some insight into what was the highest selling product, and if those are the same or if they're different.
Okay, so I go back to the Name Nate 2, of course. I just love that thing. And then what I did was I had an NAP 140 that I bought that, and then turned the Name Nate 2 into a preamplifier, and so that was even more awesome. But I always think of the Name Nate 2. I think of the NAP 250, which was very much part of that whole the Pratt pace, rhythm, and timing thing that was sweeping Europe and sort of in the U.S. So the NAP 250 was always considered the classic. Some of the preamps were. The other one that I have a strong feeling toward is the CD3, which was Name's first CD player. And I had one. And again, I was buying, I had Sonys and Mitsubishis and all these, and Magnavoxes and all these little CD players that would sound great for a while and then just give up the ghost after a year. And I got the Name, which was, it was $1,900 at the time, which was a lot for a CD player. But it was the first time that not only did I have something that was great sounding, but it never broke down. I had it for over 10 years. I wound up giving it to somebody. I wouldn't be surprised if it's still out there working, playing CDs.
Yeah.
Steve, what do you think?
Yeah. It's I've got similar choices, I think. My first would be the NAP 250. I think it's great. I've got one here. Goodness knows how many versions we've done now. So I got the NAP 250 DR, which is a discrete regulator. So I think, I just want to keep that one going. That's going to be in the product lineup for a long time, for different guys all the time, and just keep on tweaking it, keep on improving it. So everything we learn from statements and other products, just keep on popping it in that little beauty. Nate 1
Mm.
and 2. I've got one on a pedestal in the corridor as R&D walk to the canteen. Yeah, I just and like you said,
Nice,
I was trying to
nice.
buy one, just a second-hand one, just from my own personal collection, and even the broken ones are just too expensive. So yeah, they got a super following. But yeah, it's little transistors, and so it's quite brave to make such a low power amplifier. But I think the transistor can only do so much, and to say, okay, I'm going to emphasize current over voltage swing and do it that way. And there was this saying, sort of name watts. We used to always be quite conservative on the power readings. That's if we gave them. And it's really down to the current. And now we still design high current. And the highest current one is statement, of course. That's doing burst of over 100 amps, 9,000 watts, only for like milliseconds. But it's colossal amounts of current. The highest selling and the favorite, I don't always think correlate. Yeah, I think our highest selling product is Muso. So I love it. I sprinkle them around the house, and whenever friends come over, they hear it and go, "What's that? I want one." So that's sold the most, and it's our little Trojan horse of spreading the name word. But it encompasses everything we do, really. That's in there. But I think I'm an audiophile, so I'm gonna pick the NUP 250 DR. It's my favorite. But,
So I just want to mention that the Muso, the QT, I heard, what was it, about 4 years ago, was the first time I had it. That is what got me into streaming audio. Digital streaming. I started doing it through a Muso, and it was so easy, and the interface was so great, and I really started to love the sound of the Muso after a while. It was, there's that initial thing where it's coming from a single point source, but it was really easy to sit next to it, have it on a table next to you, and be completely immersed in the sound. But because the interface was so easy, that is the single thing that finally convinced me to start investigating the digital streaming services. And so, yeah, I'm a fan of the Muso as well.
So we have the digital products that we're talking about in the Muso series. We have the classic amplifiers. One of the things that Naim has decided to jump into more recently is the turntable realm. And they did not do it, very on the budget side. They went for what I would consider to be a more statement piece. Can you kind of just talk about what the thought process was getting into that, why you guys decided to get back into turntables, and what makes the design that you guys chose special?
Yeah, it's our first turntable, so we're quite proud of that. All R&D, sales, and marketing, we've all got turntables at home. We are always using it, and I think everybody in sort of 1990s we saw CE, and it was the new thing, and we all use that. So we're taking phono stages out of products, and I think you sort of start to look at sort of 2000s and 2010s, and you sort of, I think you're missing something from that experience, and I don't know if it's because it's too easy to skip to the next track, so you don't allow yourself to get into what the artist is trying to convey. I say it's the artwork. I don't know. But I think at Naim there was always this underlying buzz that we just want to recreate it, and we'd stop making the arrow our arm to go on the Lin turntables. It was just getting too difficult to manufacture for making one a month. So I think it had reached this sort of critical mass at this point about 4 years ago that we were really sort of buzzing about it. And so it all sort of took off, and we met a manufacturing partner, Clear Audio, to help us. They got all the engineering tools to help us put our ideas into a product. And so we recreated Arrow, made the turntable, new phono stage, new power supply to go with it. So it's really getting back in.
One of the things I noticed, I think most people would notice about Naim products, that they tend to have the same kind of style and shape. I'm not going to say simple. It's recognizable as Naim design, but it's not generally speaking, huge, gaudy audiophile, catch your eye. It's a little more understated. Is that something that was like a part of the industrial design from the beginning and that you want to stick with? I know that the statement pieces are a bit more of a visual statement as well, but the simplicity of the casework and name is always something I've noticed as identifiable. How does that kind of sit with the rest of the brand? And have you guys ever thought about making something that just look crazy? Or is it something that I guess I'm asking that's more about being classic and the classic amp and the classic shape?
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, it came from Julian designing with so little features and just wanting. It was all about the amplifier inside the box, and not the box. And he came up with this great extrusion that was like an O section that wraps around the whole amplifier. Is an AP250. Actually, the first ones were plate metal. And I think as an engineer, you're just it should be as simple as possible, no simpler. I think Einstein said, and I think Julian took that philosophy. And then certainly in later years, we were fortunate to work with Simon Matthews, our industrial designer, and he's a long-term Naim fan. He saved up for a Naim when, as you did, Mark, and so he started designing for Naim. I don't know, maybe 25 years ago, something like that. And his sort of passion for the audio and the design language has just evolved over the years. And Simon has his 7 pillars of industrial design that he applies to Naim products, so we can keep that continuity through ranges. So there's rectilinear, light, waves you see on heatsink and such. So yeah, it's quite a conscious styling now to keep it simple, rectilinear, and just to have those elements.
Yeah, it was actually going to all the audio shows early on. It was one of the first things that actually stood out to me along the market. So you would think that like the simplicity would make it blend in, but the high end manner and the simplicity makes it stand out amongst the other styles out there in some weird way. But in like the green, Macintosh has the blue bopping meters, but that green glow off of the front panel, I think it's instantly recognizable and an excellent choice because there's only so many colors to kind of grab and put there, and no one seems to really want pink so far.
Yeah, the greens were chosen because they're the most efficient LEDs, and the LEDs generate noise, and so the green sounded better than the reds.
So I had the Super Nate 3. I just plugged it in yesterday, and it was such a exciting, warm, nostalgic feeling when I flipped it on and the green came up, and I went, ah. So it's a thing. When you're when you're in the name, that green becomes a very important part of the whole thing because that's what you're looking at the whole time, and it's really nice. I mean, I realized that I missed that look for so long, and I'm glad that it's I can have it once again.
I noticed that the name nomenclature, the way you guys name things, like the NAIT, I'm assuming stands for Name Integrated. Why aren't the CD players NACD? Yeah. And does NAIM actually stand for something?
I think, does it depend on who's in the room at the time? So, yeah, you're absolutely right. NAIT is Nate, is Naim Audio Integrated, and NAP for AP250 is Naim Audio Power. Preamp would have been the same, so they called it Control, so Naim Audio Control. NT for tuners. I think you sort of run out of letters, and so things like the power supply started to sort of break that tradition, and so it was things like high cap or high capacity power supply, as it was called, and I guess NACD was too close to NAC, so it was broken. Yeah, and we try and keep those words, like Snagso is the name Audio Crossover. And so you can kind of almost make your own names up. If we were to invent something, you can almost know what we call it. It's fun. It's good fun.
Like the name frame. So that was kind of branching out, but it's frame, it's their equipment rack. Brian was talking about a certain kind of look to that name frame rack was absolutely beautiful. We had never seen anything like it up to that point, and we actually had people saying, "Oh, I think this is the first time I've actually heard a rack make a difference." But that was name frame, and it was FRAIM, and I always thought that was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, that was nice. It worked out well, that one. Yeah, as an interesting design, as Roy George design. And it's all about getting rid of the energy fast through glass and ball bearings. And
I saw one out in the wild not too long ago, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's a name frame!" So yeah, they're very, very lovely racks, and they do work really well. You could set up the racks and customize the racks, but it was very good for putting name equipment into it, and it all looked so beautiful and neat and lined up and perfectly spaced. So it was quite a product at the time.
yeah, there was another interesting thing. And a lot of frames, they're one size, and with the name frame, you can add a shelf. And with name equipment, there's quite often a
Right.
supply upgrade, so you can just buy a shelf, buy a power supply, and just
Right.
grow with it.
And that brings up something else is really quick, is that Name was really one of the first companies that I dealt with that really paid attention to power supplies and the role of the power supply in the sound. And so that's why you have flat caps and super caps and high caps and everything. And I've used all of those, and they're something. And that was the first time I really realized that, hey, the power supply is important to the sound.
Yeah, it is. It's tremendously important. I did a listening test for some press when we launched the NAP 250DR, just to try and convey what difference this makes. And I suppose one way to explain it is that what we like to do, for example, designing an NAP 250, is to design nice simple circuits that signals nice and fast through, but then be in the best environment possible. So that means, we're mechanically structured. But the power supply is one of the most critical things. So we think of an amplifier as only having one input, right. And that's just the audio input, but the inputs are all over it. There's thermal inputs, vibration inputs from microphonics, but one of the biggest is the power supplies. So a simple circuit may reduce the noise going in at 70 dB and such like that. So it's really an input to an amplifier. And as a amplifier drives current to the loudspeaker, that drum beat, you will see the power supply dip down instantaneously, just like the audio signal. And that dip on the power supply will be distorted by your power supply or the reservoir capacitors on there. And that dip then goes into the amplifier and then comes out of the amplifier. So it's amplifying its own noise. It's generated on its power supply. So if you can make that a lower distortion sound on the power supply, then you're onto a winner. So the test I did, it's quite hard to explain, but I had an amplifier playing music into a dummy load, so you couldn't hear it. Then I got a second amplifier, and I connected it to the power supply and to a speaker. So what we were doing, we were listening. The amplifier was amplifying the noise on the power supply rails. First of all, I got an amplifier NAP 250, which is unregulated. Played the music, and you can hear the music perfectly. You can hear the vocal. It's all intelligible. Then I got the NAP 250 and played that, and it was dramatically reduced because it's got a regulated supply. And then you listen to the NAP 250DR, and it is quieter. It's 30 dB lower impedance, but it's how that sound on the power supply sounds as well, because we have to make sure that's clean as it gets injected back in. So yeah, it's power supplies. They're in the signal path. We pay great attention to them.
You mentioned some talk of wattage and current and voltage. They're all obviously tied together. You made, though, however, some emphasis to current. How do you feel that current plays a role in audiophile quality and power when so much emphasis is really put on wattage of an amplifier in that kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think If loudspeakers were perfect resistors, then it would be just down to the watts. But they're not. They're not resistive. They're very reactive. They have moving parts with coils and magnets, and so if a cone goes out, when it comes back in, it's a generated back EMF. And as you go through crossover regions, and where the bass units go through port resonances and such, you get very low impedance dips. And if you get the amplifier on the bench and you drive it into an 8 ohm load, it's all beautiful. Drive it into a 4 ohm load, you see distortions coming up a little bit more. Into 2 ohms, you may be worried about keeping it on a bit longer, the protection circuit might cut in. Drive it into half an ohm and just look at how the output stage behaves. And quite often you get what we call little parasitic oscillations. So just little oscillations riding on the back of the main signal. And they can really harden up notes. And so a good test for it is to listen to, excuse me, the loudest, purest piano notes you can and see if you can hear any distortions in it. And if it's got good high current drive and can drive low impedances, that should come out beautifully clean. But Paul Miller, a hi-fi reviewer, who also makes testing of this fabulous machine that he makes to test amplifiers into low impedances. And you can actually measure the distortion into impedances that you shouldn't be able to measure it into.
I'm just getting some information here on the back end that Naim is a pun on the word
Name.
actual name. Julian's sense of humor when he couldn't think of a name for his company. So the idea of name.
There was the advertisements. There was the advertisement that was classic. Was sorry I didn't catch your name, which is, and then there's a picture of a guy standing and the amp is falling into the hardwood floor and crushed the floor. Open is sitting there.
Yeah, that has to be
I kind of knew that story.
I love that. We got it around the factory. Love it. That's the guy in the photograph is actually the photographer, and quite often in the adverts, it's people from the factory, anywhere in the factory.
The one thing that I'm interested in, and perhaps nobody else is I had two. I had a CD3 CD player, so I had two CD players, and then I had the CDX2, and I've heard I had a lot of seat time with the CD555 as well, and I've always considered Naim to make some of the best CD players ever in history, and I just always loved the sound, and so I looked at the current line, and it's basically the latest version of the CD5X, and so I had a question about, is Naim kind of done with one box CD players? They're not going to make any more. They're just going to keep this one as long as it's relevant and making sales. Or do you guys are you still interested in the idea of a one box CD player and that you could still bring out something special?
I think honestly, I think that's our last conventional CD player like that. So we've still got a CD player in the Unity Start, which is a CD player and a ripper.
Right.
And we've got the Unity Core, which is a CD player ripper. But in terms of other CD players, I think we could add some value to it and keep on making a better one. I think we've learned some digital techniques that would make CD playback better. So to do a CD 555, we could do a better one. But there's so many products we could be working on. So the parts are incredibly hard to get as well. And I think vinyl sales were outstripping CD now as well. So it shows that emphasis. I think we've reached the sort of ultimate destination for audio, where we get audio from as well. So I think, well, certainly for us guys at Naim, we tend to listen to string during the week and then vinyl at the weekends, and I think what is going to get more instantaneous and better quality than streaming, we got high res, and as soon as the album's released, you can listen to it seconds later, and that's just fabulous. And I think whilst that's fabulous, you miss out on that flipping through albums in a record store. It's great, and the people you meet there. And so I think vinyl fills that hole. So those two together fill it. And I think if we had CD as well, I think it'll carry on as niche, but I think it's not quite the same as flipping through a vinyl and playback. I don't think it can be two physical mediums, and I don't ever seeing a new physical medium for audio being developed. I think that's it. I think we've reached the end for all
Right.
all new audio
that's a good
formats in a way. I would get new codecs, but it's streaming and vinyl, and I think that's set in for a long way. And I think those two have just squeezed CD out a little bit.
I'm about to burn my CDs onto a server, but it was just one of those things that's I just remember it's like, oh, those CD players, they were so great, but I understand that because I was a distributor for a while for a company that still was selling the one box CD players, and I wasn't selling any, and they were, why aren't you selling them? They're still selling in Europe, and I'm like, I don't know. People are moving on, and I know it's the death of the CD player, and it's going away, but I still think fondly of the name CD players, and maybe I'll just look for a used one or what is it? The CD5 is the current one, CD5i X.
Yes, SI. Yeah, that one's still going. Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody, if you need a good one box player, that's a good solution. Yeah, it's their name CD players are, they're just amazing. They're really good.
Yeah, it's really well done, I think. The Mexican are run out one day. Yeah. What the interesting thing about that, you were saying you'd like rip your CDs.
Right.
If you rip a CD, the way it's doing it is different to a CD. A CD player's real time playing out. Right. And ripping, we use the exact audio engine in our rippers, and so it keeps retrying until it's got through the errors rather than trying to interpolate over them. So you can get a better rip than CD playback, which is quite interesting. But the CDS3 was fun, and then the CD555, there was such detailed design. It's really looking back to all the circuits and using the PCM 1704 DACs as well in there, multi-level DACs, get the power supplies right on those. Then how we split the filtering away. It's a sort of 2 third order filters cascaded, and this is sort of using zero feedback little circuits for the filters, and the signal just rips through it and just pushing that high frequency noise floor down. And the digital design, so even the smallest digital signal inside the servo control and such just would spoil the sound. That's why it's got no digital outputs on your CD3, because just SPDIF output spoilt it. And we tried putting a sort of a logic switch on it, so a fly-by-wire switch to switch it off where it's generating the chip, and it still had an effect, just generating a little bit of 11 megahertz RF inside of a product.
Steve, I think you bring up a really good point about the CD getting squeezed out by vinyl and streaming. In your mind, do you see vinyl getting squeezed out of the equation eventually? Or do you think that, because I see, because Chord also produced a CD player in a time when streaming was really taking off, right? So they want to go after the nostalgic market who has a collection of CDs. But you're 100% right. Over a long enough timeline, this possession of CDs, people are going to get tired. It's probably not going to make it, if I had to guess, right? It's not going to make it the long haul. But will vinyl make it the long haul? Will it be this relic of the past that we hold on far into the future? Or is everybody going to give up the ghost, as you said, Mark, earlier, and just go to streaming and everything will be gone?
Yeah, it's gonna be around for years, isn't it?
It is
too enjoyable. I think there's just something special about it. And it's so much more than just the you can argue the sound quality between the two, and it is a beautiful sound, but I think it's so much more than that. I think it's the way that we consume audio, and I love new music, and so for me, I can have a real Tidal session, and I'll listen to 30 seconds of 100 tracks before I settle down, and I know it's bad for me. I shouldn't be doing that. And then I listen to vinyl, and I sit down and I consume it in a completely different way. would Pink Floyd ever exist if we got streaming? Can you make that sort of prog rock? I think I think it's just something special that's not going to go. And if people invest in vinyl and turntables, they're going to want to keep it going. Record stores, they love it. I think it's such a good part of the hobby.
Yeah, there's a lot of community wrapped around it, I think, that the other mediums don't necessarily have. And if you ask me, its own digital, individual, bite-sized is the opposite of community. You consume it on headphones, you consume a single track at a time or 30 seconds of a track at a time, as you mentioned. And the idea of collective is so much more around the vinyl, right? It's like you collectively sit down, you can collect it. It's more of community and bringing people together, I think, in a world that's increasingly single-serving pieces. So,
and you know what? And people like of my age grew up with a record player on the floor and your friends all surrounding it and listening to it, and that's how we exposed ourselves to music.
Yeah.
Is the record player, sitting around the record player with your friends. So, and I think we still feel that's still a very special feeling to do that.
Yeah, you go into a friend's house, they got records on the floor, you're just over it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, come on, I know what we're gonna do.
Yeah, it's not quite the same as somebody shows you their phone and you're looking at a playlist.
Yeah, exactly.
I agree. Steve, is there anything you kind of like to say to the audiophile community as we kind of draw to a close here?
If you're a Naim fan, thank you for that. And I think it's just a great hobby. And I think I don't think of it as just making music machines. I think we just make machines that sort of provoke an emotional response and all those hormones. And I think there's so few things that we can buy in this complicated world that can give us that. A car doesn't necessarily do it. Houses, watches, all this. And I think there's just something special about high-end audio. And I think once you've experienced it and you live with it, then it's just magic.
Steve, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers,
guys.
as they say on your side
Cheers.
of the pond. Cheers.
Right.
Cheers.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.